Thank you everyone for coming along this evening. Here we all are again to prove that it is in fact possible to have civil, productive, even enjoyable and enlightening public discussions on difficult topics like energy policy. So I'll introduce myself. I'm Amanda Cam and I'm your MC for this evening. My current day job is I am the member for Whitsunday. So if you have ventured to Hamilton Island or any of those beautiful places in North Queensland, that is my home. While Brisbane Dialogues have had quite a few former politicians as speakers, always balanced between the major parties, I gather I am the first sitting politician. I prefer parliamentarian, in fact, to break the stereotype. So I'm privileged to represent a region that is representative of many who work in the energy and resources sector, and communities who are also very passionate and strong advocates for our natural environment, and in particular, our living wonder of the world, our Great Barrier Reef. I'm very pleased to participate in the non-partisan spirit of the organisation, Brisbane Dialogues, and help push back against the polarisation, which is damaging our society and stifling debate. Like everyone here, I am here too to actively listen to the panel this evening, their insights, their articulations, and to gain better understanding from both sides of the nuclear debate. In my short time in politics, only 2.5 years, when discussing nuclear energy, I have observed the political debate, one of spin, of fear, of controversy, and of contention. If left to only politicians, we may never know the facts. That is why I am pleased to be part of tonight's important respectful dialogue and its contribution to the public policy debate. Now, I need to make mention, because energy policy is so fundamental to prosperity, to equity, to the environment, and it is complicated. Many people have very strong views, and this is a good time to reinstate the Brisbane Rule for those that may or may not be familiar with it, created for the launch of the Brisbane Dialogues as a calming background to tonight's discussion. All participants agree to listen carefully, speak respectfully, and concentrate on the content of discussions, not on characters, before, during and afterwards, online and offline as well. Now, to some housekeeping, please turn your mobile phone to silent if you haven't already. Fire exits are obvious, but we have staff here that will guide us out in the case of emergency. We have toilets as well, down to the right. Feel free to move about as much as you like throughout the evening to refill your glass or grab some food. That's it from housekeeping. And now it is customary at the big dialogues for the MC to acknowledge, on behalf of all present, the traditional custodians of the places on which we gather and converse this evening, by referring to a principle or element of dialogue in Aboriginal culture. This one I would like to refer to tonight is of particular significance when we are discussing polarising topics. In brief, the process of dialogue is more important than the particular outcome. No matter how important the issue under discussion, the journey along the way is more important than the destination. Or if you like, civil discourse itself is more important than any particular policy conclusion. Now, on behalf of all present, I'd also like to thank the current custodians, the owners and managements of the Tivoli and its sister over the river, the Princess Theatre, who so generously provide these congenial places for our purpose and our enjoyment here this evening. Their support has been constant and invaluable for over 3 years now, and include an incredible difficult period for them over those past 3 years. So I also acknowledge and thank our returning event sponsor, Andrew and Liverson Academy, for innovation and leadership, who have not only contributed financially but also editorially. And of course, a huge thanks, as always, to the small band of volunteers, many who were here very early this evening, and the many others who in numerous ways, large and small, enable everything to happen so that we can enjoy our night. Also, a plug for the Brisbane Dialogues is Australia's first dedicated civil discourse or bridging organisation, and arguably the only truly dependent, non-parochial, neutral forum for public and private discussion of big ideas, issues, at least in our great state of Queensland. Thank you. The Brisbane Dialogues has an ambitious national expansion program via dialogues at school and collaboration on public dialogues. They're always keen to talk to potential volunteers, supporters and partners, so please do not hesitate to reach out later this evening or in the coming days. Now, before introducing the speakers, I'd like to encourage everyone to text questions to the number that you can see on the screen from time to time. Succinct, relevant questions with names given may be used later throughout the discussion. So we'll take a moment to get that number down. And now I would like to introduce our speakers for this evening for our big dialogue. Firstly, Rod Campbell is the Research Director of the Australia Institute, a progressive think tank with a particular interest in the economics of mining and energy. Welcome, Rod. Catherine Tay is a strategist at Tay & Co, social licence and sustainable development consultant, and you may have heard Catherine's interview earlier this week or late last week with Steve Austin on ABC. Stephen Wilson is adjunct professor at the University of Queensland, energy industry consultant and nuclear advocate. And last but certainly not least, our moderator for tonight is Andrew Fraser, former Treasurer of Queensland and now Professional Director with a wide range of roles, including Chair of Australian Retirement Trust and Chancellor of Griffith University. And Andrew and I share two things in common, aside from our passion from calling to serve our state. We are both from the small country town of Proserpine, where our families for over many generations made significant contributions to our community. And while he's the Grand Chancellor at Griffith University, I'm a Griffith University student finishing my MBA, so we've had that discussion as well. I know that our grandparents together would be very humbled, as I am, that we are sharing in this event this evening in the stage. Thank you, Andrew, for being here. Welcome, and over to you.
Thanks, Amanda, and good evening, everyone. And maybe in the spirit of the breaching across divides and putting aside partisan or past partisan views, maybe I can share equally on the basis of Amanda's very generous remarks, a grand reveal for you all, and that is, having grown up in Proserpine, Amanda's great uncle, Ron Cam, was the member for Whitsunday from 1961 to 1980. And a little known fact is he was the MC at my parents' wedding. So that should make dealing with nuclear energy pretty easy if we can go straight across the partisan divide like that. Welcome to the panel. In terms of introducing tonight's topic, I decided rather than producing a new soliloquy, I bowerbirded a range of quotes over the last little while as I refreshed my own views and understanding on some of these topics. And so I thought I'd just share these 5 quotes, which come from different perspectives and pick up some different points, which I think will probably form part of the discussion here tonight before I then pass over to the panel to make their introductory remarks. So the first quote is from 2022, and it's from the International Energy Agency Executive Director, Fatih Birol. And Fatih said, "In today's context of the global energy crisis, skyrocketing fossil fuel prices, energy security challenges, and ambitious climate commitments, nuclear power has an opportunity to stage a comeback. However, a new era for nuclear power is by no means guaranteed. It will depend on government putting in place robust policies to ensure safe and sustainable operation of nuclear plants for years to come, and to mobilise the necessary investments, including in new technologies. And the nuclear industry must quickly address the issues of cost overruns and project delays that have bedevilled the construction of new plants in advanced economies." Quote 1. Quote 2 is actually from a colleague Chancellor, Peter Varghese, who has hosted one of these forums before. And this was actually in a foreword to a paper that Stephen wrote. And in that, Peter put this proposition: does it remain sensible for Australia, the world's largest repository of uranium, to export uranium but prohibit the safe use of this technology for itself? The prohibition of nuclear energy reflected the concerns of the time, especially about safety and waste disposal. But does it make sense in our times, where climate change is a much more urgent issue and where today's modern, more compact engineering designs, especially small modular reactors, have reframed the safety and security concerns. Quote 3, from the GenCost report, some of you will be familiar with it, published by the CSIRO and AEMO. Since 2018, the GenCost report has shown that wind and solar are the cheapest forms of newly built electricity generation. This is true even when considering additional costs that arise due to the variable nature of renewables. This includes the cost of energy storage and transmission. Quote 4 is from McKinsey Sustainability, which I can only guess is different from McKinsey itself, which I presume is also sustainable, but maybe not McKinsey unsustainability. Nevertheless, this quote is also from 2022. Unlike renewables that offer an intermittent energy supply, nuclear has already demonstrated that it can provide 24/7 reliable and flexible power while using far less land than many renewables. A proven and safe technology, it provides 10% of global electricity generation, and it's the largest single source of zero carbon power in the United States. It also has the only zero carbon option that works for high temperature industrial processes such as steel or cement production. Nuclear is a key element in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's pathway to net zero. And finally, from the Scientific American, a journal some of you may be familiar with, been knocking around for about 140 years and opining fairly authoritatively, in an article that Jeremy Su wrote in March 2021. Instead of fear, activism, or political oversight, what has profoundly weakened the outlook for nuclear power is a shift in the economics of electricity generation that favours cheaper natural gas and renewables, such as wind and solar energy. But nuclear power advocates, and some environmentalists, still see nuclear power as a cornerstone of clean energy policies meant to address climate change. So, with that Cook's tour around some of the perspectives that we'll no doubt draw out tonight, Catherine has already declared herself on ABC Radio to be, quote, sitting uncomfortably on the fence. So I'm going to invite Catherine to lead off with her introductory remarks before passing to Rod and then coming back to Steve. Catherine.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we have a moment now where we're being told we have a global boiling point, and therefore the urgency for energy transition has gone from incredibly urgent to incredibly urgent faster. And yet what we have all over Australia and also globally is examples of the slowing down of the delivery capacity of our communities to actually do it. So we're impacted by 10,000 kilometres of transmission line being a requirement of the renewable vision that we have in the nation. And we need 110 new renewable plants, with CEOs of some of the largest energy companies saying they refuse to continue to invest private money when there isn't certainty about the transmission lines. And we have protests from farmers and from communities about things like the impact of transmission lines, about the cumulative effects of solar and wind. And as a result of all of these concerns and issues, the idea that we will fall short of the target becomes, I think, a critical concern to what should be a concern to every single member of our community. You know, whenever I go into a community to talk about nuclear, or there are concerns that arise immediately about the waste issues related to uranium, storage issues, but most concern is nuclear proliferation, and with the rule of law being challenged or broken down by fears around Russia and Ukraine, etc., the concerns just continue to escalate. What and how could this be done, whether it is potentially part of the pathway. So even if Australia didn't have such a negative view on nuclear, the context for overturning the laws as they stand are harder than they've been. So nevertheless, whenever I go into a community to talk about a wind project that's got trouble or a solar project that's had trouble, the question the community asks is, why don't you think about thorium or nuclear? Why aren't we thinking about baseload power in a different way? Or increasingly, people are asking the question, well, why don't we have, 100 Teslas instead of this transmission line? So communities are thirsty for a lot of engineering information and insight around why choices are being made. And our companies and governments aren't used to having to address communities on all of these different issues and actually have the authorised two-way dialogue to resolve these concerns. So we have a scenario of an increasing appetite and engagement, increasing awareness of options and optionality, and urgency coming together in what I think is potentially a toxic cocktail. And I particularly believe that we need to unpack that really carefully. And social licence is a good way of thinking about it because it's helping us understand what community expectations are and prioritising the resolution of the most important aspects and criteria, and many of these multi-criteria decisions can be made at different levels, from local all the way through to national and international. And communities are quite capable of weighing up all of these differences. They just need more information, more insight, more ability to have the full range of options be made available to them. And so I think it's great to have an opportunity to look at where our commonalities lie and where there are open questions that really need to be addressed. So I welcome this opportunity to talk about it.
Thanks, Catherine. And I might just ask all participants to obey the drumstick or cornetto rule of holding the microphone, so like you're about to eat the top off it is the best way. So Rod, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Hi, everyone. I'm Rod Campbell, and I'm an economist. Like most economists, I like to tell jokes. And so, since we're here at a nuclear show, cockroaches can survive a nuclear meltdown, but they can't survive a slap with a newspaper, which demonstrates just how toxic some of our newspapers are. Boom, boom. I wasn't expecting a clap. Just while we're getting to know each other, just loosely, who here considers themselves loosely pro-nuclear? And how many economists are in the room? Yeah, so there's a good reason why there's not very many economists and there's quite a lot of people who are pro-nuclear here. That's because the economics of nuclear energy in most situations really doesn't stack up. And it certainly doesn't stack up in the Australian electricity market as it stands. Nuclear energy is really good at producing a large amount of energy very, very consistently, and that's not how the Australian electricity system works. We have what they call so nuclear, good at large amounts of electricity, 24 hours a day, generally in one place. The Australian electricity market is spread out across very long areas with differing load needs, and we have huge demand peaks in the afternoon or in the evening, and very little demand and high solar output during the day. So the electricity market in Australia needs something that responds to the needs of the minute and the hour, and that is not nuclear energy. Interrelated with the poor economics of nuclear energy is its probably more famous problems, There's a small chance of catastrophic outcomes. We still don't really know what to do with the waste. Indigenous communities are certainly universally opposed to having. I shouldn't say universally opposed. I don't speak for Indigenous communities, but Indigenous communities in Australia are generally very opposed to having nuclear waste on their land. And let me say it again, it's really expensive. It takes a very long time to build, and in a moment of climate crisis, we don't need things that take a long time to build for fairly speculative outcomes. Technology, nuclear technology, I'm not an expert on it, but in terms of what energy markets are buying and investing in, nuclear energy, the small modular reactors that we hear about, there's only a handful of them in the world. I don't want to use sort of loaded terms, but the major or serious investors in Australia's energy systems aren't hankering to invest in small modular reactors. And I guess where we land is the Australian energy system as it is, and the Australian energy system that we're broadly sort of heading towards, as much as anyone can know the future, isn't a place where nuclear energy is going to be necessary. And I was saying to some of the guys before the show, you don't ask engineers what they want and build your economy and community around that. You work out in a democratic system what the community wants, and then you tell your engineers and your economists, build us an energy system that supports the kind of community and the kind of society, the kind of economy that we want to have. And so, given that the current Australian system doesn't need nuclear energy, the reasonably foreseeable Australian energy system doesn't appear to need nuclear energy, at least not as far as major investors, economists and regulators are concerned. It seems to me that we don't need nuclear energy unless we want quite a different Australia. And that's where I think a lot of nuclear advocates are kind of putting the cart before the horse and advocating for nuclear energy rather than what nuclear energy could be good for in Australia. If Australia, and sort of in the spirit of agreement and trying to land on one page, if Australia wants to produce a huge amount of the world's aluminium, which we certainly could, or other kinds of mineral processing that needs a huge amount of very steady electricity supply, if we had cities with tens of millions of people in them, moving between them in bullet trains and other things that might like to run in the middle of the night, if those things were to happen, then perhaps nuclear energy could find a home in Australia, and perhaps even economists could get on board. But I think that's kind of the point. If you're advocating for nuclear energy in Australia, you're not actually advocating for something that's conservative and in line with our current institutions. You're advocating for something that's radical, and to do that, you need to put forward a radical vision for what you want the country to look like. And I guess I've never seen that put forward. I certainly haven't seen it put forward in a detailed fashion that might make me think, okay, that's the kind of vision that could see a nuclear Australia. And so in that sense, we're probably winding up for time, but I guess given there seems to be so little role for nuclear energy in the current and reasonably foreseeable Australian systems, maintaining our ban on nuclear energy actually makes a lot of sense, because it stops us from discussing and spending a lot of time and, more importantly, money on bad ideas. The Australian energy system and Australian energy debate is routinely hijacked by rent seekers and terrible ideas. You need look no further than the nonsense that gets said about carbon capture and storage this very week in Parliament to know that Australian energy debates are easily hijacked by rent seekers, and keeping the ban on nuclear energy keeps them at a safe distance. perhaps I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Rod. Slightly over 5 minutes, but I didn't provide a budget for you to have
Sorry
a joke
about that.
at the start, so we'll forgive that on this occasion. Stephen.
Thank you. Great to see so many people turn out to listen to this topic. I thought I'd start by addressing the topic of the debate, which is net zero without nuclear ? So the view that I've come to is that I don't think it will be practically plausible to achieve anything close to net zero if we don't have nuclear power in the system. That's just for the power system, let alone getting rid of all the emissions from the whole economy. The reason I've come to that view is I think that the practical engineering problems will be too large. By the way, modern 21st century nuclear technology can balance with variable load, so that's something that is important to understand. If it is possible to solve the challenges of running a power system just with wind, solar and some hydro and some storage, then I think the economics of that is going to be extremely daunting. And what matters here is the total system cost. This is what's being missed. It's actually come into the public domain in the newspapers in the last couple of weeks, is that this hasn't been correctly accounted for in the work that Andrew referred to, the gen cost work. They're basically ignoring the system integration costs and the transmission costs and treating them as zero. And then if we can run the system, if we do go ahead and take all these very high economic costs, then I think that's going to translate into very, very difficult, very daunting politics. So they're my three big reasons: engineering, economics and politics. If we want a 21st century system with low or no CO2 emissions. The second point is the reality of this situation we're in today is that the power system is being driven off a cliff. I first said this publicly in 2016, and you can see it in figure 1 of the study that UQ published, which Andrew referred to. And I think in 2023, people are starting to understand this problem. So this gives you some sense of how long it takes for these kind of messages to filter through. Now, what about the market? Rod's referred to the market, the national electricity market. Didn't we, in the 1990s, reform the market to, quote, let the market decide, unquote? Now, I'm on public record as saying that we're testing the national electricity market to destruction. Great idea in an engineering lab, but not a great idea to test your national market to destruction. Isn't nuclear difficult, dangerous and divisive? Now, I used to think that it was too dangerous. I used to think it was too difficult as well. And embarrassingly, before I did the UQ study, I thought it was technically too hard for Australia to do nuclear. But having done that work, I've actually changed my mind on that. So if we were to do it, yes, we would have to change the law. We would have to repeal the bans. We would have to do a lot more than that. There's a huge amount of work that we would have to do. But our conclusion was it's not too difficult. So what did we recommend? We recommended that we must create the real options starting now. So regardless of what I think or Catherine or Rod or any of you think, our recommendation is we need to create the options so that when we get to 2030, a little bit after, around that time, that we're actually in a position to make the choice and that we've created those options. Collectively, that's what I call Plan B. That's basically prudential planning. Now, I used to be afraid of nuclear energy. I used to think it was too dangerous. I've changed my mind about that. I'm probably the slowest learner in this room. It took me 35 years from when I was a 15-year-old schoolboy being pumped full of anti-nuclear propaganda in 1983 to change my mind on that. And I'm nearly done, Andrew. I used to think it was politically divisive. I now believe it's a unifying issue. So if you only remember one thing that I say tonight, it is that nuclear energy is a unifying issue. It's bringing together conservatives, business people, unions, people in the Labor family, environmentalists, especially the under 40s environmentalists. And I think this is very significant, and that is my radical vision.
Thanks to all three of our panellists for starting off the debate. Maybe if we go back to one of the last points you were making around the creation of the option, and I might pass to Rod on this point. So, as an economist, as we think about the trajectory here, how would we value the option? How would we price the option of a nuclear participation in the electricity industry?
I mean, I think we could talk about real options valuations all night, but I'm just worried that that might not be very interesting. I think the bigger question is almost, why do we keep returning to this as an option when mainstream investors and our current market, our regulators, keep dismissing it? And why do we keep returning to nuclear when other technologies tend to have fallen by the wayside? We don't talk very much about geothermal energy. We don't talk very much about wave energy at the moment. And the reason for it is the close links between civilian nuclear energy and defence. And it's because between defence and I guess between and with right-wing politics more broadly. And so there's always there's always an industry and a series of interest groups that are interested in talking about nuclear, whereas there aren't interest groups ready to talk about wave energy, ready to talk about geothermal energy. It's these other links that keep this option on the table. So, what is that option worth? In economic terms, really not very much, but it's worth a lot to defence, to parts of politics that actually do want to wedge the left in particular by saying, well, you don't like climate change, why don't you want nuclear? Nuclear provides option value to defence and to an option to wedge parts of politics, and I think that's where the value is, not in terms of economics or finance.
And Catherine, in your work, I'm going to guess and predict that as you go around into communities and there's an issue with Project X or Transmission Line Y, that nearly everyone who has an issue is proposing a different option as the ready-made solution that everyone else should particularly see at face value. So as you think about that concept of optionality in the work that you do, how would you translate what communities say about the options to deal with the issue?
Yeah, I think the fact that it's hard to get a whole lot of insight around the valid options for every particular situation, that's it's party to the way that projects are executed. You go in with a specific project in mind, you do the feasibility, you've got the investors, and now you're doing the consultation to get community support to get it over the line. It's by the design of the process, it falls short of what communities expect. They want to understand what is the problem and then why have we designed this as the solution, and then go into, well, now here is the design, and we come to them too late in the process where it's almost a fait accompli, and we're way too low down the consultation ladder for them to really do what Rod's saying, which is that they could be shaping the solution for them. I think there's some really exciting work being done over in Western Australia where they're able to engage with communities where transmission lines are, or distribution lines, for example, are things that they are literally engaging with their community about, to say, well, what are the range of options? Because they've got transmission, distribution, and a sort of connected system that's thinking about these things from the community point of view. And I feel like that's really a vital step, because otherwise communities just whole-as-bowls reject the solution that you've given them, in part because you've designed it without involving them.
So maybe if we pick up the thread of an economist's option, an engineer's option, and then what the community regards as an option, and try and draw together some common ground here to push this debate forward. I'm going to propose, and I did slightly warn, but not really truthfully warn panellists about this in the green room, to go for some yes-nos here. So if you want to pick up your microphone as a buzzer, I'm going to try and work out whether there's a basis to move a little forward here. So, first question, which is a yes-no, is, are we all signed up to net zero 2050?
Yep.
Yes.
You're not playing, Stephen?
What does signed up mean? So the legal answer is yes. The legal answer is that both major political parties have said we are going to try to do this.
Well, so in the context of this discussion, which is getting to net zero with or without nuclear, I'm establishing, are we agreed that we're heading towards net zero?
Hang on, what's the question? Are we heading towards it, or are we? This debate is framed within.
I guess, Stephen,
if you
I would
want to
say,
get to net zero.
Yeah.
If in this debate, it is if you want to get to net zero, can you do that without nuclear? And I'm saying no, you can't.
Yeah.
So next, yes, no. Do we agree that energy policy should be viewed through the energy trilemma of cost, security and environment, or as it's sometimes expressed, equity, security and sustainability?
Yes, there's no other choice.
Yep.
No, I think there's one thing missing, affordability. It's a major issue that we're having major social and economic implications for our community.
That's in my trilemma, Catherine.
So-
Affordability is in my trilemma.
So if we allow the concept of cost/equity to expand to include that?
Yeah, socio-economic distribution.
Yeah. Third one, so cost estimates for policy purposes should compare apples and apples. I include all costs, including external costs and of course capital costs.
Yes.
Sure.
Sorry, I was still focused on the last question.
When we do cost estimates, we should do apples and apples and include all externalities and all costs, not just a sliver of costs.
Yes, absolutely.
And do it transparently so that everyone can trace from your data inputs through to your results.
So there's a bit of commonality there, although you guys are really bad at yes/no answers.
I think I've been doing pretty well.
Yeah.
Well, you told a joke and did actually. So far, so good, Rod. I acknowledge that. So then, if we return to the central point here, which is how do we achieve net zero with or without nuclear? Rod, from your perspective, having put a view at the start, if nuclear is not to be included, what are the workhorses that get us to a net zero proposition?
Demand management, demand shifting, and we're in Australia's capital of demand management here in Queensland. It's great to be here. And batteries, other forms of storage, hydro, and there's a lot of storage options that I think are only just being that are incredibly cheap and only just being assessed. Things like cooling down commercial buildings when electricity is cheap and then not using electricity other times of the day. Effectively using buildings as a form of storage. There's all kinds of storage options. The costs for them are coming down. You're seeing economies, even in South Australia, where we're getting to sort of 60-70% renewable energy. It's being done, and by 2050 it'll certainly be done in the view of mainstream economics.
I think there's also an opportunity to broaden out from electricity, which is only 23%, and this is what's happening overseas, and start to think about other carbon sources as well. So fuels, as an example.
Andrew, I think I've got a credit in the bank here, because on the last round before the quick answers, you bypassed me. So can I can I throw something in here? So, Rod, I'm going to ask Rod a question. Yeah, because Rod, you made a lot of big statements there, and one of the statements that you made was essentially you're saying that there's this kind of cynical political game going on where these kind of crazy right-wing people keep talking about nuclear. I actually think there's a much more basic set of debates we're having about like really sort of nitty-gritty technical issues. So there's actually technical disagreement about what can and can't be done. But you made this statement about wedging, and I'm kind of curious. So who is Xi Jinping wedging with the world's largest nuclear build program?
But I mean, I think this is where we agree. And as I said right at the top, if you've got a population of 1.7 billion that does most of the world's metal smelting, most of the world's manufacturing, then there's probably going to be parts of that system, parts of that economy where nuclear can be a competitive option, and a lot of those external costs that Catherine's talking about and Andrew's talking about might be manageable. But you're also seeing one of the world's superpowers flex its defence and defence-related technology muscles. Like, who is he wedging? Most of the US and Europe, I would say. Like, there's enormous political and military strategic value for the Chinese government in saying we can build nuclear and we can do it really well and we can do it better than all of you. Who's he wedging? I think there's heaps of potential people.
So, Catherine, you want to make a comment? I am just going to note that solving regional security is a topic for another night, but it's a cracking debate.
Well, I mean, the relationship here, I think, is that if what we are relying on for national sovereignty and the energy transition plays directly into the geopolitics of all of this, we do have to consider the need for us to have the ability to smelt our own minerals, critical minerals in particular, to fuel our own energy transition and or the allies broadly. So, creating options that would allow us to do that cheaply, I think is a strategically important thing for us to consider.
So I'm going to pick up the lead of the panel members here. And Stephen, you started this. So one of the things that we might pose in the context of pulling this thread with the topic at hand is the AUKUS deal. So AUKUS proposes that half a dozen or so nuclear-powered submarines will be part of the Australian Navy fleet, howsoever constituted. And one could imagine that if that was a decision taken perhaps in the 1980s, that levels of opposition from particular parts of the community might have been immediately very high and visible. But one thing that is my perspective on this so far is the aspects of the AUKUS deal that's probably received the least attention is the fact of nuclear power. So how do we think that translates, or what lessons do we take out of that lack of purchase of the nuclear power question in the AUKUS deal from your perspective? I'm going to go, because you've called me out, I'm going to go this way now, Stephen.
Thanks, Andrew. I have to admit, I was amazed, maybe amazed is too strong, I was very surprised when the AUKUS deal was announced how little drama it caused. It was like 7 a.m, 15th of September 2021, wasn't it? And then ABC Radio, big announcement, few questions, and then it was just like, okay, next. next issue, move on. It was just amazing. So it was like the whole country just sort of went, yep, that makes sense. And someone had said to me a few months earlier, you know what, Stephen, I think it's going to be easier to have the defence conversation about nuclear propulsion first and the civilian energy conversation second. And I said, yeah. He said, he had no special inside information, not a political person. I said, yeah, if you said that to me 2 years ago, I would have thought you were mad, but now I think you might be right, and he was right. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing I'd say is that there's no question at all that the AUKUS decision has catalysed the public. It's opened up and permitted an open public debate about nuclear energy, and I don't think there's any way we can stop that now.
Or in the alternative, is the remarkable thing that there's not been a lot of debate about the fact of nuclear propulsion?
Yeah, and I think the reason is that people understand that if you want to have a 21st century submarine fleet that can do what it needs to do, you need nuclear propulsion to achieve that. And I think, you know, if someone said we're going to turn the Navy back to sail power, people would say, well, that's not going to work. And that it's just the fundamental characteristic of the energy form that we're dealing with. And that's the same problems appear in a different example in the power system. If you try and run a whole power system, it's going to be a big problem.
So I'll go to Catherine, but obviously Rod, the economist, would say that the Navy shouldn't go back to sails, right?
I like sailing.
Me too.
Topic for another night. Catherine.
I think it's a question of what was the most mature context for that discussion, and I think it was the geopolitical threat question that became more important, and therefore the answer seemed to be acceptable, which is nuclear. And that's why there wasn't a lot of controversy. In the case of energy transition, the frame of reference that we've had is that we have an answer already. And I was at the Clean Energy Conference in Sydney a couple of weeks ago where there was a yes-no game as well. 3 ministers on stage.
They would have been terrible at it. I didn't even know who they were.
There was only one question they all could answer with a single word, which is nuclear part of the mix for the future? And they all said no. And that's because contextually, renewable and transmission lines is the vision that politically everybody has signed up to. And that's why I agree with Rod. To overturn this is such a significant challenge, but I don't think it's just the right wing that's challenging it. You know, while it's true Dutton has that view, there is also other people who are, generally speaking, let's say on the Green side, that are also open, or union representative I talked to this week is also open. So it's a evolving discussion, mainly because the context is now the urgency of the energy transition.
And Rod, what does AUKUS tell us or not tell us about nuclear propulsion and nuclear power in Australia?
I think it's a terrible decision. AUKUS looks like being one of the greatest wastes of money in Australia's history. The idea that unmanned underwater drones, smart mines, the way drones are making manned aircraft irrelevant, exactly the same thing's going to happen under the water, in my view. And it's not really my field, but plenty of people whose field it is think that. I think what AUKUS shows us is the immunity from normal economics and even normal politics that anything nuclear has, because it's backed by huge military industrial complex, huge capital, massive rent seeking. That's what's driving the AUKUS deal, not a sober assessment of Australia's strategic needs and foreign policy.
I have to sort of just, on the question of huge capital, it's also huge capital to build 10,000 kilometres of transmission line and 110 solar and wind projects. the whole thing is an enormous capital. So while I agree, nuclear has a significant amount of financial cost associated with it, the other vision does too. I think that's worth noting.
Yeah, sure. But 360 billion on nuclear submarines that we may or may not need,
Right.
that's an entirely unforced error.
Yeah, but Rod, the 368 billion is the biggest possible number they could put on it, because it includes the whole lifetime of that. That's not just the vessels. That's like the whole lifetime of wages and labour and servicing, and there's this, this whole supporting structure underneath it. It's not the physical hardware of the submarines. That's a very small fraction of that.
So perhaps just to flag to folks here that, of course, this panel will include a discussion on SMRs. No modern nuclear discussion cannot include that. But just on this point before we perhaps go there, is notable when I was traversing some parts of the actual bans that are in place is, maybe some people in the room know this, but the legislated ban on nuclear facilities in Queensland, which is the Nuclear Facilities Prohibition Act of 2007, includes at subsection 2C of section 7 an exclusion for vessels. Somewhat interesting in this context of a debate. Now, one of the things about nuclear power that we talked about right at the start in some of those quotes was the capital cost and the size, a range of other issues, and many proponents now say that SMRs, or small modular reactors, are the golden solution to that. Stephen, what say you?
I say it's a mistake to think of anything as a golden solution, and it's a mistake to look for magic bullets. But I have also come to the view, when I first heard of SMRs, I should say this as well, I thought it was a mad idea. And it was Tony Irwin, who's our most experienced nuclear engineer. He commissioned 8 of the 16 reactors in the UK earlier in his career, and he commissioned the Opal research reactor. And I said, Tony, we can't have nuclear in Australia because they're too big, and they can't load follow, blah, 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 all the things that Rod's been saying. He said, no, we're looking at SMRs. I said, what's an SMR? He said, it's a small modular reactor. I said, what's that? And he explained it to me. I said, that's mad because you're just giving up all the economies of scale. Why would you do that? So that was the view I had in 2018 when I first heard it. But having done the research and having done the work and worked through it all, I've changed my view on that. And
in only 5 years, that's
so I'm
miles
speeding
quicker
up.
than 35 years.
Yeah, I'm learning fast.
Rod?
There's only a handful of them in the world, entirely unproven, cost estimates entirely without basis. I think the logic of it is also a bit problematic. I mean, we haven't learnt well how to build really big nuclear reactors. They continue to go way past original cost estimates, almost as if the cost estimate doesn't really apply to this technology. And the idea that we haven't really learnt to build a big one, but we'll be able to build a factory that builds lots of little ones. The building of the factory is something that still hasn't been done. And in fact, building a factory to make lots of small nuclear reactors is harder than just, as far as I understand, just building nuclear reactors. So, I guess, again, mainstream economist view, like carbon capture and storage, it's always 5 or 10 years away, and I'll believe it when I see it.
So, Catherine, when we were chatting earlier, you talked about the greatest project would be trying to restart sand mining on Stradbroke. That's going to take quite an effort. But can you, as a social licence author or social licence driver, can you get the SMR across the line?
I've actually thought about it for a long time. My first uranium project that I reviewed was in 1994, and the company that I was working for at the time, North Broken Hill Pico, thought then that an argument that they could use to put forward the rationale for Jabiluka was climate change. And there was a real sort of move, I remember, to shape up the rationale and including talking about the technology, the smaller reactors and the evolution of that. And if you trace what's happened in America, despite the fact that they've still and have operating nuclear reactors, they've only really commissioned 2 large ones in the last decade. And there is a lot of excitement about these smaller ones. But as Rod said, it's still relatively new, and the timelines are long. So here we would have to have a real effort to overturn legislation. In one of the states, I was speaking to some key people in South Australia, it's illegal to even talk about it. So
Surely that can't be right.
well, I couldn't find the piece of legislation, but that's what I was told by a senior bureaucrat. So even if the legislation isn't there, that's how they feel about it. And so there isn't really even an open discussion about the option and what does that mean and how would we regulate it and how would we think about it. So I think we're years away from having the right legislative setting. But we are falling behind other countries that have got it as an option. And I think that's of concern.
And Andrew, I think there's a key point here on cost and the word we. The word we is the most overused word in a lot of these debates, never gets properly defined. So if you look at the West, so if you look at Western countries, Rod, like United States and in particular, but other Western countries, and you look at the data on project delivery of large nuclear reactors, definitely there's a problem. And the mistake is doing, sort of one big project and giving up. The mistake is the approach to regulation and so forth. But if you look at the East, so if you look at Asia all the way to the Middle East, and you look at, the Koreans have just delivered a 4-unit plant in Baraka in the UAE on time and on budget very, very efficiently. And you look at how China delivers projects. You look at the Japanese nuclear build-out historically, very efficient, very cost-effective, very on time, very on budget. And I think there's a tendency of countries like Australia in the West to have this sort of slightly arrogant attitude, if I might say so, that we know everything, and then to just ignore the fact that actually, hey, these guys over here are actually outperforming us, and I think we should look to those countries and learn.
So let me pick this issue up about a potential future for nuclear energy in Australia and pose this provocation. So there's a federal ban on nuclear energy which dates back to the Howard government era in the late 1990s, and then most states, but not all, have their own separate bans. In a hypothetical scenario where all of that legislation fell away tomorrow, does a nuclear facility become more tenable and get built? Or put another way, is the ban the problem?
I have a view on this, but I won't jump in yet.
Well, while you think about that, I would probably just note that if it is the case that it's illegal to talk about it in South Australia, then you're all here involved in a slightly seditious activity, talking about something and engaging in an activity that could find you summarily arrested potentially in South Australia, which is what used to happen in this part of town in the 1980s. But these days we're a bit more enlightened and we can handle having a debate about topics and talking like grown-ups. So go on, Stephen.
So if the ban was removed tomorrow, so there's two kinds of people on this question. There's the pro-nuclear people and the anti-nuclear people. So there's anti-nuclear people who imagine, gosh, if the ban's removed tomorrow, it'll be terrible. There'll be nuclear plants popping up all over the place tomorrow. No, there won't. And then there's naive pro-nuclear people who think, we just have to get rid of the bans and then it'll just magically happen. No, it won't. If you want to see the amount of work that needs to be done, that was what our report at UQ was answering. What would be required to actually do this? And we set that out in 48 convenient pages for your review.
Rod, is the ban the actual problem here, or is it other issues?
Oh, if the ban fell away tomorrow, I don't think that would make Origin, AGL, Energy Australia, or up here, CS Energy, Stanmore, suddenly want to build a nuclear reactor. No. It might make a politician like Scott Morrison or Anthony Albanese or anyone try to steal a march on their opposition by saying, we're going to build a Aussie nuclear reactor and throw the political dice. And suddenly you're seeing energy policy and investment decisions being made on base political calculations, just like we've seen defence policy go the same way. So, if it was overturned tomorrow, would we see moves to build a nuclear reactor? Not from commercial investors, but maybe from political opportunists, absolutely.
Catherine, do you have a view that if the ban was lifted tomorrow, whether that materially changes the social licence task?
I think the fact that there's a ban is a reflection of the way the community thought previously, as opposed to whether they still feel that way. But I think the task of getting a nuclear power plant approved with community support is absolutely enormous, and more than likely to be met with a lot of opposition. I can't foresee us doing that in a way that communities would actually want a nuclear power plant, though there are countries like in France where communities are quite satisfied and strategies are in place to have community support. I just think that we are so conditioned to be fearful of it that it would take a lot of addressing concerns at every level for people to feel satisfied.
There's a little story here from the US, which is that the state of Wyoming, which has got a lot in common with Queensland, produces a lot of coal, exports it to other states rather than overseas, and was kind of an anti-nuclear type state because they were pro-coal. That attitude has changed, and when the company that Bill Gates started, that Warren Buffett's an investor in, wanted to find a site for their first reactor, they went to 4 communities in Wyoming with old coal-fired power plants, and they said, this is who we are, this is what we're doing. Would you be interested in hosting a nuclear reactor to replace the old coal plant when that's retired? And all 4 of the communities said, yes, we'd love to be the host of the first nuclear plant in Wyoming. And so they said, well, you can't all be first, but stick with us. And they chose one. So that's an interesting story about on the ground community acceptance. These are small communities, small towns, 2,500 people. Yeah.
And they're quite anti-solar and wind as well, aren't they?
Not sure. Maybe they're a bit sceptical. Yeah.
I think that you raise a really interesting point, though, of the interaction between nuclear energy, nuclear advocacy, coal, gas, energy exports, etc. And I think this is where nuclear advocacy really struggles to win friends in Australia, because as someone who's been involved in opposing coal exports, opposing the expansion of gas exports, I've never seen a pro-nuclear group put in a submission on a coal mine, lock themselves to a fracking rig, express any kind of concern about the Barossa project or the Northwest Shelf, I guess I would really encourage nuclear advocates in Australia to, if they're to be taken seriously as a climate solution, to get involved with the wider climate movement in a much more engaged way, because it feels really hollow, just as somebody who's been engaged with that side of the movement.
So if we think about the timing of when the bans are in place, largely they predate the broader community acceptance around climate change and the setting certainly of net zero targets. So does that tell us something about the utility of the bans vis-a-vis or compared against the need to address climate change?
So, I don't know. I think I'll just always end up back on the same point, that I don't really accept the more serious, more powerful interests that occasionally push nuclear projects in Australia. I think people coming, like Stephen, from a very academic perspective, I totally agree and we're on the same page regarding climate change. But when I hear we need nuclear, we need more uranium mining because climate change in Australia, I don't believe that it doesn't feel genuine to me, because I've never seen nuclear interests in Australia oppose fossil fuel expansion.
But the nuclear industry isn't like the psychology that you're kind of describing, the sort of, let me just loosely call it the sort of the Greenpeace style of thinking about the world. Nuclear industry people, they're just not like that. They've gone to engineering school, they're very rational, they're very calm, and the nuclear industry, the nuclear industry is, it's full of very shy people. No, seriously, the nuclear engineers, like the people in the industry, working day to day in the industry, they're very shy. They're engineers, and they don't. And in terms of their sort of value and culture, their values and their culture, they just wouldn't be out there chaining themselves to a coal mine or whatever the case may be.
I mean, I was in some of those meetings where uranium and nuclear people were talking about their idea of how they might approach a campaign, and there was no way they would even seek to associate with a pro-climate activism in the way that you're describing, because like Stephen's saying, it's a different value set. I kind of can cross over, understand an engineer. My father was an engineer, and I can understand activists. My mother was an activist. But I can go across, and understand the different parts, and I think possibly the reason why they've been talking about it since 1994, and it's now, many years later, almost 30 years later.
How old are we?
And they still don't have a campaign that works. So, I think that really answers that question. You can't rely on them to have a campaign that works. That's not really who they are.
So I'm going to make the observation that we did range into solving national security and regional security issues earlier. Let's see, when it's open mic point on the questions, whether your thesis that all nuclear folk are shy and retiring holds.
But Andrew, there's a really key point here, right? Which is that I said if there's one thing you remember tonight, it's my hypothesis, and come and challenge me on this, that this is a unifying issue, right? So and that's what we found in the US, in North America in January, February, is that among sort of conservatively minded people, it's nuclear is great because it improves national security, right? Not just for submarines, but for energy. And by the way, it's zero emissions. And then with people on the left, it's like, did you know, you do realise it's zero emissions. Oh, and by the way, it helps with security. So this is how you unify people and you find common ground. That's my hypothesis.
But I guess I don't see how you can unify. I think while sure America's really polarised in that kind of cross-partisan way, I think in terms of energy politics and climate, like that's where that big divide is in Australia. And I don't expect, mustachioed guys with tweed jackets from Ansto to lock on, but, a few tweets saying, gee, that Northwest Shelf expansion's really big, maybe it's not such a great idea. Like, that coming out of pro-nuclear organisations, we could start with a tweet, couldn't we?
Yeah, but ANSTO's very, very strictly neutral, and they don't want to be political.
Not ANSTO, but
yeah.
You get my point. Like, the broader climate movement, like, it really is zero. I can't think of a single occasion, a single social media post where a nuclear advocate has said, this coal mine should not go ahead for the sake of the climate. We might disagree on how to clean up the energy system, but we can all agree it's time to shut down fossil fuel supply. Like, I'd love to see that. I would love to see that kind of unity.
So I'm just going to foreshadow that we're going to go to questions momentarily. But in my last valiant and probably misguided attempt to bridge some of the differing views here.
I think we've done okay, haven't we?
I think we've done okay, but I think we've got a ways to go.
I've been booed at other talks, so,
Well, I thought it was good that you didn't use a Homer Simpson reference in response to the nuclear stereotype. So you started the stereotype, but we were actually provoked, and people have come here tonight with a fairly short proposition, which is net zero without nuclear. And one of the ways that we might think about that, and we've taken as the context for tonight's discussion, is in an Australian context. But actually, the net zero task is a global context and a global task. So I wonder whether or not, if we think about it in a global context, our answer is different to an Australian context. And is our answer, if it's the case that we imagine net zero in a global context includes nuclear, do we also contemplate a net zero equation that includes nuclear globally but not in Australia?
I mean, I'll just start there. I mean, nuclear exists globally, and so I don't think even the most rational economist would call for the immediate shutdown of nuclear fleets globally. So I think for the time being, sure, there's nuclear in global net zero.
I mean, I think we have significant uranium resources here in Australia, just as Canada does, and we also have places where we can store waste, and therefore
you're crossing so many red lines here.
I know. I didn't say I wasn't going to be uncontroversial. I'm sort of still, seeing that there are going to be challenges, absolutely. But I do think we should be considering it. I don't think we should rule it out. And I think we have a strategic reason to do so.
Yeah, it's. I want to say, Catherine, it's not waste. Okay, it's used fuel, and I just want to quote my friend Xeon Lights. It's only waste if you waste it. There's so much energy in that stuff, and we can reprocess it. It's not an issue. But to your question, Andrew, I think that if you're going to take a really strong climate change policy position, you do have to. It is an inherently global issue. You do have to think globally. What is it? Think global, act local. And if one of the wealthiest and most advanced countries in the world, Australia, 12th largest GDP economy in the world, if we're not able to show leadership in this technology area, I think that's a serious shortcoming. And my own personal view is that if we keep pushing down this road that we're on, and we do try to completely decarbonise Australia without nuclear energy, I think it will be an epic fail. And I think what's worse than that's not going to make much difference because we're such a small emitter. But what will happen is that the countries to our north, our neighbours, the developing emerging economies to our north will go, well, we're not going to follow those guys. So we need to show what's possible and affordable and achievable so that others can follow our example.
Okay, so Ben has the questions that have been all, I think you're invited to submit sharp, erudite and concise questions, and I think we've got a series of them that have been preloaded, so Ben.
Oh.
And I think we're waiting for a microphone for Ben. Here we go. So we're going to get a couple that you folk have pre-submitted or submitted during the course of tonight, and then we'll open to the floor to questions. Ben.
So from Alex, we have, how will the LCOE of nuclear compare to market pricing in a high renewable grid in 15, 20 years' time? Is that a justification to start nuclear projects today?
I can respond to that. So the key issue is not the levelised cost of energy at the fence of the generation plant. The key issue is the total system cost. There is an issue with our market design which allows part-time generation, random part-time generation from wind and solar to basically push push other plants off the system, and it's doing that to coal, and that has been a problem for nuclear in the United States as well. So we need to look at that problem at a system level, and we are going to have to go through a serious round of, in my view, of electricity market reform again in order to solve these issues, regardless of whether we do nuclear or not. But if we are to do nuclear, we will definitely need to solve that problem.
How many people here know what levelised cost of energy means? Pretty good, but still very small minority. I guess, look, based on current data, it doesn't look good. I agree with you that you don't plan an energy system based purely on levelised cost metrics, and that there's other things to be considered. But levelised cost of energy involves what's called a discount rate, and economists like to discount the future. If you ask yourself, would you rather have $100 today or $100 in 5 years' time, you'd rather have the $100 today. I'm guessing, I'm assuming on behalf of you all. If you ask yourself, would I rather have $100 today or have $200 in 5 years' time, suddenly it's sort of a much harder question to answer. And that rate at which you decide, actually I'd like more in the future, is what we're talking about when we call a discount rate. And so it's really important to consider at what rate are these calculations discounting the future. And this is really important for nuclear energy because it has massive, massive, massive unpredictable rehabilitation and shutdown costs decades in the future. And I remember seeing having a Twitter exchange with the energy wonk from the Australian Industry Group a while back, and there was an article up saying some nuclear facility in the US, I can't remember which one it was, they were looking at a 60-year decommissioning process, and his response was, "Oh, with a high enough discount rate, that won't hit the LCOE very hard." And I was like, "Sure, you can fiddle around with how these calculations work, but you're still talking about a 60-year decommissioning process." So I guess we're not going to make all of our energy decisions based on this one particular formula, and nor should we. But it's important to know what that formula does and how it works. And yeah, nuclear has big unknown costs out into the future. And maybe if you're trying to avoid climate change in the next 10 years or the next 20 years and minimise those emissions, maybe that doesn't matter. but know that you are loading up risk in relation to cost and potentially other environmental impacts way in the future, and your LCOE calculation might not be telling you anything very useful about that.
So we did agree at the start that all costs should be included. We just can't agree what the costs are. Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, what we do know is that if we are planning a renewable energy future, that we're 350 mines short of the amount of critical minerals required to enable the solar panels, the EV, the wind. And so the externalities might need to include critical minerals projects being fast-tracked, and there's a $400 million capital gap at the moment in place in relation to critical minerals globally. And we have a major problem with timelines on that. So there's 10 years for an average mine to be developed, and what we have is a shortfall that will begin within 2 years. So the ability for us to actually drive the renewable energy future relies on critical minerals, and that has to be calculated. So it's not just really about the cost of decommissioning nuclear plants. It's about the ability for us to resolve the timeframes of critical minerals.
Indeed. So I know there's a whole range of questions that have been submitted, so we might seek for a couple more, and maybe we'll try and keep our answers on the panel a little briefer. So Ben.
Yeah, by popular demand, just regarding small modular reactors, this is a combination from Stephen Brown and Richard. The first is there a small modular reactor in the West actually close to being open? And the second is, what are the solutions for nuclear waste? And what is the potential fallout of an SMR meltdown?
Small modular reactors in the West, we are expecting the first ones later this decade. There's several different designs, which includes designs based on well-established technology, pressurised water reactors, boiling water reactors, and some newer technology. So the general technology class is basically well-known and understood. It's just a question of scaling it down and can we or can't we achieve the kind of economies of replication that are being aimed for. The waste issue, there is a paper that's been thoroughly debunked that's still doing the rounds. It comes out of Stanford University claiming that small modular reactors will generate far more spent fuel, aka waste, than large plants. This is not true. So just be careful of that paper by Alison McFarlane and others. And you can, if you need help finding the debunking, I can point you to it. As I say, the management of spent fuel is not a big issue. It's just something that gets blown out of, that gets blown up to scare people. I used to be scared by it. And then finally, the meltdown. Basically, these designs are meltdown proof. They're extremely, all existing nuclear plants are very, 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 very safe. These are like just phenomenally, boringly safe.
Next question.
Yeah. So this is from Dan M. And I quote, "It would appear, like the wider renewables industry, that there will be a dramatic talent shortage when it comes to nuclear. How do we overcome that?"
That's one of the issues that's addressed in the UQ study. It's under capability, so it requires training. One thing I would say here that I didn't understand until I'd done the study is that in a nuclear power plant, it's not like every engineer is a nuclear specialist nuclear engineer. You need a whole range of skill sets, ordinary mechanical, civil, electrical, chemical, materials engineers, software engineers. They'll probably get a bit of extra training that's industry specific. So this is an issue, but with the lead times we're talking about and planning, there's plenty of time to train people and put them through university programs.
Money.
So let's perhaps go to the floor. There's a couple of roving mics. Can I particularly encourage you, everyone was asked for respectful questions, but if you're an iconoclastic, bombastic nuclear engineer in the room with an outstanding sense of humour, then feel free to stand up and debunk the stereotype. Down the front.
Andrew, could I just point out there are there's an upstairs mic and a downstairs mic, if you could keep your eye out.
I'm sure all the bombastic nuclear folk are upstairs, so...
Stephen, you said that you think that we can't get to net zero without nuclear, so I'd like to hear what you think the barriers are to getting there without nuclear.
Yeah, the basic challenge is that the thing that you've got to understand about electricity is that this is a non-negotiable technical requirement. You must balance generation and load, or if we put it in economic jargon, supply and demand, almost exactly, like sort of plus or minus 0.5%, almost to the millisecond, like certainly at the sub-second level. And you've got to achieve that trick continuously, like all day, every day. And if you can't do that, just at a simple operational technical level, you are at risk of collapsing or blacking out the whole system, right? And the time from a disturbance to a blackout, it can be less than 60 seconds. That was certainly the case with the South Australian blackout. And then the whole system can be black for a very long period of time. And the amount of social and technical and economic damage that you cause will be enormous. So Simon Bowler over there at the Mater Hospital, you know, they've got backup diesel generators for this reason. But that's the fundamental problem. And that's a really difficult thing to achieve technically, and it's not cheap. And achieving it with just wind and solar and storage is going to be much, much more technically difficult. Just talk to the guys who actually dispatch the system in the control room if they'll talk to you confidentially. And it's going to be really expensive.
So we'll go upstairs to the top right here, if the microphone's available.
Thank you for a very engaging discussion. I wanted to ask a question about centralisation and decentralisation and the politics of that. Obviously, nuclear requires feedstock, uranium and stuff, and I presume one group of people that's probably not going to get on board is like the libertarians who are like, I don't want to be controlled by institutions, whether that's governments or corporations. So I'd like a discussion of that.
Who would like to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with that. I mean, if you want nuclear energy in your energy system in Australia, you are looking for big state-linked corporations running with massive taxpayer-backed subsidies. That's what you want. That's what you're looking for.
And I think we've got another...
Can I just respond to that? This is a really, really good question, and it's a really important point. So when you're talking to people on the conservative side, you'll find people on the conservative side of politics who are keen about nuclear but naive about this issue, right? So it's definitely the case that if you want to have a nuclear energy sector, there is a role for the state, a role for government that is indispensable. So one of the questions we need to discuss collectively as a society is, what is the role of government? What is the role of the state? And how can we get to a place where the left and the right and the green part of politics agree on that? And so we don't live in a full-blown libertarian society where we've privatised every road and footpath. We do have common assets, and we do things collectively and cooperatively. And the power system is probably a natural place for a little bit of that to happen.
So I'll go up here and then down here.
Well, for 16 years I've built nuclear power stations in England and in Germany. And 40 years ago, Germany started exactly what we are proposing to do in Australia. Stop nuclear and go for solar and wind. 27,000 wind turbines are producing energy, but sometimes not less than 6% of their capacity is available. Didn't matter. They got cheap Russian gas and built more and more gas power stations. And when the pipelines in the Baltic were cut, what was the situation?
Energy prices went up 10 times for Germany.
They reactivated 27 coal-fired stations. So after 40 years, they realized wind and solar doesn't work.
I think we'll take that as a comment.
No,
let's go with it.
Can I respond to that? And look, I don't know much about Germany or the way its system works, but this is exactly the problem I'm talking about, that nuclear advocates tend to be antagonistic towards the rest of the movement, or the rest of the sector, whatever you want to call it, other parts of society that are also really passionate about trying to clean up our energy system. And to stand there and say wind and solar don't work, I mean, of course they work. They work every day, all around Australia, all around the world, generating, I can't even guess what the megawatt hours are. Of course they work, of course, but they need to be managed. But I don't think it helps anyone for nuclear advocates or anyone who's keen on nuclear energy, or anyone who's keen on a rational energy system, to have this antagonism between nuclear advocates and other forms of energy. I think it's really counterproductive.
Can I say something here? So I think everything our colleague, our friend here has said is correct. I do know a little bit about Germany. I worked on gas energy security issues in Europe out of London for 8 years. The problems are real. The German understanding of this problem was incorrect. So Germany's been making 3 big blunders, which were in the letter that A.D. Patterson wrote to the Prime Minister, right? Over-reliance on wind and solar. Naive over-reliance on wind and solar. Not understanding the importance of gas security of supply, and rejection of nuclear energy. And Australia's got exactly the same 3 policy settings. And so we will have serious problems in this country if we don't learn the lesson of Germany. They are realising the problem in Germany. And the mistaken energy policy settings of the German government is, in my view, and in the view of the Ukrainian ambassador to Australia, a fundamental error that was a contributing factor to the war in Ukraine, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
So we're going to go down the front here with the microphone. We've got a question up the back, is it? No? One up the back, and then come down here with the mic. Thanks. Whoever's got the microphone up the back.
Thank you. Good day, everybody. My name's Ben Beattie. I'm an electrical engineer, and I don't mind admitting to everybody that I'm a sceptic of the transition. So my question is primarily to Rod. In the terms of a transition in Australia to net zero, how does Rod explain to a farmer who might have to live under a 500 kV transmission line now that the renewables transition is more important than a nuclear transition?
I mean, I think it's a false binary. I don't think anyone's saying you have to live with a nuclear power plant or you have to live with a transmission line. I mean, I see a lot of the discussion around transmission. I mean, people who are interested in the energy system have been talking about transmission for years and years. I feel like it's almost being used as a bit of a Trojan horse now to say, oh, well, gee, transmission's expensive, oh, gee, we didn't think about that. People have been thinking about this for a long time. And I think absolutely Catherine's right that transmission lines need proper consultation. I think there's real problems. I've been really interested in Victorian guy Bruce Mountain's views on transmission issues in Western Victoria. And in a nutshell, his view is that the regulator AEMO's been captured by transmission interests, and there's a massive overspend going on in transmission that locks in sort of regulated profits. I think there's a lot of debate there, but I think it's a false binary to say you've got to live with the transmission line or you've got to live with a nuclear power plant. I think the reality is a lot more complex than that, or subtle.
So we've got a microphone down the front here now.
That's why we're waiting.
Yeah,
I just think it's really
please.
important to not slow down the transmission line, actually solve it faster. So the either or, while I don't think it's a false binary, it is useful to think about, nuclear and or transmission and renewable. The key question is, how do we speed all of these options up so that we actually get to net zero? Because that, this is the thing that really struck me about the Brolgas and the microbats driving a wind project in Victoria to a non-commercial size, is that, while we're thinking immediately of the biodiversity issues of today's climate, how are we taking into account the future climate and the impact on the Brolga and the microbat by not having a renewable energy project go ahead? We're not. Our planning system isn't taking the future into account, and that's a real problem. So, in all of this discussion, I think we need to be standing in the future of 2030 and saying, what are the things that we will have had to have done very differently than we are doing now in order to speed up the process and bring communities on board for that?
Perhaps after we solve the Brolga discount rate, we can solve the levelised cost debate. I'm going to take the last question from the floor down here, please.
Good evening. Thank you for your time, panel. So Lee Staines, formerly one of the co-founding partners of the energy transition business at PwC. Big emphasis on the formerly. But I had the pleasure to meet with Stephen when you came and spoke with us a few months ago after your visit to America. And I think the one thing that we haven't touched on as much as I thought we might have tonight is, of course, around the pragmatic and practical issues of supply chain and getting these things off the ground. And Catherine has made a couple of comments around the challenges we face in getting the various resources we need to build all of our projects, whether that's the transmission lines, the mines, the solar panels, etc. But Stephen shared some really interesting information with us around the practical nature of if we overturn the ban tomorrow. And by the way, my personal view is that all options should be on the table, is that actually there's a backlog in getting into the supply chain for building a nuclear plant. And I thought it might be interesting if you could share that with the audience, so that even if we decided tomorrow that we'd like to build some in Australia, we might actually be in a position where we have to get in the queue, and the queue might actually now be getting very far ahead for us to be able to even take that action.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that you've raised a really important point, which is that we need to think deeply. So we need to think not in a shallow sort of like time slice sense. You can't click your fingers and have a nuclear power plant. It's not like going to the showroom and buying a car. It's probably more like going to Boeing or Airbus and ordering some jets. That's not something you just do on a quiet Wednesday afternoon. That's like a process with a lead time and conversations. And, and big airlines were having conversations with the manufacturers when the A380 was still on the drawing board, or the 787 was still on the drawing board. So the fact that SMRs, are not up and operating yet is not a reason to not be having those conversations. So, grown-up countries like Poland and Romania and other countries like that are having conversations right now with American reactor vendors about, what's the process from where we are today to having, a fleet of these plants at such and such a year in the future. And so you start with, just like Dow Chemical did, for their plant in Louisiana. You start with an MOU and then you gradually work forward and you firm up an understanding and you come to orders. And so that's the mindset that we need to be in. And if we don't get into that mindset as a country, we will be left behind, I think.
Catherine.
And that's not just the mindset for nuclear, it's also for transmission lines, for solar, wind, batteries, everything.
Olympic infrastructure.
All
phasing out coal and gas, phasing out coal exports.
Right. I mean, so the level of queuing that's happening because all countries are moving at the same time at a great rate. It's a scale of change that's so significant. We need to be in the queue ahead and getting faster. And that sort of goes to the urgency.
Righto, folks. So I'm going to invite Amanda back up to formally close proceedings, but perhaps just to round out and thanking personally each of the panellists and all of you for participating. The task was net zero without nuclear, and I'm not sure we got there in an Australian context, but I think we may have got there for an answer in a global context, and depending on how we think about this topic, that probably informs the way that we answer that question, at least in some part. I started with a quote, so I'm going to finish with a different quote. This is a Matthew Warren quote out of the AFR, written no less on Anzac Day. Why is it Australians can accept nuclear energy when it's about defence, but not when it's about energy? Climate and defence have much in common. Both involve a multi-billion-dollar domestic response to a long-term global threat. Both face technology risks which can strand assets or make them redundant. Both address strategic threats in the future which are apparent but abstract in the present day. Thank you all for your participation, and back to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, I think they all deserve a big round of applause, and I'll start with our moderator, Andrew Fraser. He can come and take the job of Speaker anytime at the Queensland Parliament. He did a fantastic job, and I think what this panel proves in the respectful debate...
I'm retired by popular demand.
I'll call for you. And I think what this debate and respectful discussion has demonstrated is that there is a place and there is a need for this discussion. I certainly would love to see school children of our state come and see this debate rather than some of the debate they see, sadly, at our state and federal level, because sadly it's not sometimes at the calibre it needs to be. And I think that is a takeaway for me here, and I'm sure many, is that we do need to have a very mature, respectful, long-term strategic debate at all levels of government, and in partnership and collaboration with business, the industry, our academics and community is really, really critical. I plan on inviting Rod and Stephen sailing up to the Whitsunday Race Week in a couple of weeks, because it's the only thing they think that they agreed on this evening. And Catherine, I've got a beautiful fence for you to sit on that we can observe that sailing. It's right on Hamilton Island, so you're welcome anytime in my part of the world. But there were certainly some things that we can take away, and they are the lessons learned by other nations right now, in the past. Thank you for your contribution, sir. And also into the future. And we are an island nation that is resource rich. We have incredible expertise. We have incredible human capital. And we really need to be moving the debate along a lot quicker. No matter what the outcome, the importance is the debate and the journey on the way. It takes leadership, and it takes an ability to unite on a common cause, which I was pleased to hear everybody agrees. We need a target, and we agree on what that target is. And I think it's just important to note whether it is metallurgical coal exports. I fly over to coal terminals every time I travel to Brisbane, and I have made a commitment to myself to educate the great people of Queensland that metallurgical coal, of which is 80% of what we export, there's 60 ships off the Port of Hay Point today waiting for those exports, and it is that resource that contributes to renewables when it comes to wind and solar manufacturing, actually. We certainly need that. And it is important that we note also, whether it be critical minerals, whether it be a debate on nuclear, that the time frames that it takes to do business in this country is extraordinary, actually, and we need to do that better. But I think by one conversation and one dialogue at a time, we are doing that. In the interest of time, we have dispensed with the usual flowers, and in fact, everybody received gifts before they even came out on stage this evening out in the back in the green room, and we thank Brisbane Dialogues for that. I do want to thank Andrew Fraser. You did a fantastic job tonight, Andrew. Thank you. Great to have you being here. And he has a very busy schedule. So we appreciate it. It takes a lot of work behind the scenes in the lead up to an event like this. To conclude the evening, all feedback, offers of support, introductions, suggestions and questions are welcome by either the cards on your table or seats, or by any digital method as well. Brisbane Dialogues is going to experiment with its first online forum in the form of a temporary one to extend tonight's discussion. So look out for a link which is valid for ticket holders only. And I think that's fantastic. All guests are welcome to continue to use the upper bar, which I think is up there somewhere, the light up there, thank you. And while the speakers will join the premium ticket holders and volunteers only downstairs here at the lower bar to thank them for their volunteering this evening. Thanks again to everyone for your contribution, whether that be just in attending tonight and listening, or whether that be in participating in the debate. It is important that we have across the aisle discussion, and I think tonight was an outstanding example of how we can do that better. Please carry on at home, work with friends, and please spread the word of the Brisbane Dialogues so that we can ensure that we have future well-attended discussions. Thank you and good night.